In a world plagued by major intersecting crises, it's critical that any conversation about driving change address this reality. So in this double bill of back-to-back panels, we'll discuss how to line up civil society, business, and governments to tackle these ongoing challenges head-on. For our first panel, we have the executive director of the Dalberg Group, one of Africa's most notable international development strategy firms, James Mwangi. A UN veteran with deep international cooperation experience who now serves as the UN resident coordinator in China, Siddharth Chatterjee, and the head of strategic communications and knowledge management at the multinational consulting firm DAI, Eneni Ejembi. So that's our first panel, and we'll open up the conversation from there by connecting local realities to global themes for our second panel. Our speakers will be the current and first ever female Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, who's also a former Vice President of Costa Rica, Rebecca Grinspan. The former Secretary General of Global Civil Society Alliance Civicus and current Chief Executive of Oxfam Great Britain, Danny Sriskandarajah, and the current Civicus Secretary General, who spearheaded transnational campaigns calling for government accountability and served as Global Campaigns Director for Save the Children, Lisa John. Finally, our moderator for both panels is an award-winning global security strategist, women's rights advocate, and physician, as well as an SDG advocate emeritus and UN high-level commissioner on health employment and economic growth. Please take it away, Dr. Ala Moravit.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for our panel, Responding to the Times, Equity, Access, and Recovery. The global economy has been wounded by the impact of COVID-19, military conflict, climate change, and the drawback of women's rights, and severe constraints on the future of food, energy, and finance. Inflationary and access pressures on food and oil supplies are adding to an already precarious economic environment, making the lives and livelihood of people globally increasingly fragile. Estimates state that this risks tipping up to 1.7 billion people, over 1/5 of humanity, into poverty, destitution, and hunger. Alarmingly, the fight against poverty and inequality could be set back by an entire generation, and it's clear that drastic action is needed to prevent the world's most vulnerable from becoming collateral damage. Today, I am joined by three incredible leaders who are driving local action and transformation. James Mwangi, the Executive Director of Dalberg, Siddharth Chatterjee, the UN Resident Coordinator in China, and Eneni Ejembi, Head of Strategic Communications and Knowledge Management at DAI. James, as the founder of Climate Action Platform for Africa, you're helping drive economic transformation in Africa through large-scale climate action. What do you see as the role of the private sector in fighting poverty and inequalities and ultimately achieving sustainable development?
Thank you for that question, Ella. I think a lot of this proceeds from that idea of shifting from a frame around a climate change as a challenge to climate action as a call, as an opportunity, as an area of new activity. And I think a big chunk of the challenge of bringing the private sector to issues of sustainable development has been the fact that when it is framed purely as a set of obligations and challenges, then private sector, because of their obligations to shareholders, and which is all of us who all want our dividend checks at the end of the year through our pension funds and so on and so forth, it ends up being of necessity a limited aspect of what the world of business, which employs most of us, again, can do. If we can instead say, what is the kind of world we need in the future? What are the changes to our production systems, our energy systems, our food systems, et cetera, that we need to see? And can we frame those as opportunities? Then we're able to unlock the productive capacity of the private sector in a meaningful way. The best example I can come up with is the minute that people stopped thinking about the need to transform our transportation networks from just a pure obligation question to one around the future of e-mobility, suddenly you saw billions of dollars, entire economies increasingly being mobilized around the race for this new product. And I think we can repeat that across a range of sectors, creating opportunity from the climate challenge and funneling that energy towards making sure that there's equitable access for all.
So can I ask, how can we get that to happen on issues that are a little bit more politically or socially sensitive?
I think that there's two pieces of the answer there. The first is to recognize that issues are not that distinct. So for example, increasingly, I came to climate action not as someone who was thinking about how we address the climate change issue, and then came to climate action, but as someone who was thinking about how do you get to jobs? How do you get to dignified livelihoods? How do you get to the resources necessary to pay for social services and so on? And saying this is the biggest restructuring of the global economy in history that's going to happen over the next few decades. And in that lie the opportunities to realize value in all of these other aspects of the SDGs. However, there are other aspects around basic rights of humanity that just don't lend themselves to market mechanisms, and we have to accept that. We have to acknowledge that for certain issues, we're going to need a different set of tools. And there, we're calling upon private sector to be good citizens, but we're calling upon civil society and the space created for civil society and good governance to really lead the fight. There is no market for certain basic rights of humanity, and we shouldn't try and create one.
Yeah, but it's more about citizens and corporations working together in partnership to build the kind of societies and communities we want. That turns me to Siddharth. For the past 25 years, you've led an international cooperation, humanitarian coordination, and peace and security. So in this time of increasing global fragmentation, how do we promote a united strategy across countries for sustainable development?
So Ala, what the COVID-19 pandemic did was it struck humanity like a bolt of lightning. And in that flash, we saw the contours of inequality emerge. Inequality in countries, inequality between countries, inequalities in societies, and what became even more stark were the inequalities of gender. However advanced an economy is, it put a spotlight on something which had not been stress tested, perhaps in humanity in a long time. And today we face multiple crises. We have a COVID-19 pandemic, which is a major health crisis. In fact, it has brought, it echoes the 1930s, crisis, the financial crisis that the world faced. We are also seeing a climate crisis, and it kind of poses what the Secretary General calls an existentialist threat. We are confronted with conflicts, increasing levels of conflicts all across the world. And finally, we are seeing the combination of a financial, an energy, and a fuel crisis. So we are facing a threat which perhaps humanity, since perhaps the end of the Second World War, has not seen, and yet we've increased in terms of numbers. Over 100 million people have been displaced or have been, because of the consequences of what we are seeing.
Yeah.
So we are seeing a disruption at a level which we had not even anticipated. And therefore, today, the 2030 agenda is the only bright spot, the only North Star that we can embrace. And it is an agenda which is of unprecedented scope and significance. It is accepted by all countries and is applicable to all contexts, taking into account different national realities, capacities, and levels of development, and respecting national policies and priorities. Now, these are universal goals and targets that involve the entire world, developed and developing countries.
Yeah.
We have less than 8 years to achieve the SDGs. And as the UN Deputy Secretary General often reminds all of us as UN resident coordinators all over the world, she says, ladies and gentlemen, you have to flip the orthodoxy if you want to achieve these agendas on time. And therefore, be clear, no country, institution, or company has the resources to achieve the SDGs alone. And therefore, strengthening multilateralism is our only choice. Through global partnerships, which include governments, enterprises, individuals, we can take action to innovate together for the 2030 agenda. Now, China, the country I serve, as the second largest economy in the world, has important lessons to share with the rest of the developing world. Since its reforms in the late 1970s, don't forget, China is coming out of a per capita GDP of $180 in 1979, where Kenya's per capita GDP was higher than that of China's. And China has, in these last 42 years, has seen remarkable economic and social transformation, and eventually lifting over 750 million people out of abject and extreme poverty. I believe the scope and role of multilateralism has to be re-emphasized if we are to have a chance to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Back to you, Alan.
So, Stark, can you tell me, what does it mean to re-emphasize the scope and goal? How do we actually, especially after the past 2 years, but even before that, we saw rising food insecurity. We saw, a lack of political and even social support for migrants. We've been seeing this for some time. I remember prior to the COVID pandemic, the Secretary General talking about the increasingly violent, misogynistic rhetoric. So this has all been on the rise for some time. COVID simply exacerbated and accelerated it. How do we bring people back to the sense that this is a collective responsibility? And how do we particularly do that with governments and to James's point, with corporations, in what feels like an increasingly inward-looking approach? How do we do it?
You know, that is why I want to re-emphasize the role of the multilateral system. But within this multilateral system, Anna, I see the most significant role of young people. Take Kenya. I used to serve there as the UN resident coordinator. Kenya's median age is 18. Most of Africa's median age is 18. Africa will have a population of 2.5 billion by 2050. This is potentially the world's largest market of consumers and producers that is coming up. However, in order for Africa to succeed, we have to nurture those markets now. And those markets can be nurtured when it's not just governments, but the public sector, the private sector, governments, civil society, and individuals coming together and leading to social transformation. The voices of young people, therefore, becomes very, very significant in this entire architecture. It is young people that will drive this change. It is young people. We are looking at 1.8 billion young people all over the world. And in Africa alone, we are going to have by 2050, 890 million young people in the age group of 18 to 40. You know, now this is a viable human asset. What does it take? As the UN Secretary General, as a champion of the Generation Unlimited, often emphasizes that by 2030, we must have every young person in the world employed, trained, and educated. Now, if we can get that right, I believe political leaders across the world are responding to that, whether it's in Kenya, which just demonstrated a fabulous transition of power and authority, and at the same time, across the rest of the world, as more and more political leaders get responsive to their young people, I believe this change will come from there because they become foundational to the very safeguarding, not just of our planet, but our entire humanity.
Yeah, and ideally, the young people end up becoming the political leaders sooner rather than later. Anene, I'm going to turn it over to you. You've spent the past 19 years leading in financial services and international development, both in the United Kingdom and Nigeria. I have to ask what will seem like an easy question to answer, but one I worry is increasingly difficult to actually deliver on. And that is, how do we turn this ambition for global cooperation, this ambition for the Sustainable Development Goals into local action? How do we effectively translate it, and how do we effectively support it?
It's a really good question. And if there were pat answers, then we could all take it and go home. And I would
that's
be
what I'm
out
hoping
of
we
a job.
do. I'm hoping you give me this answer that we can all just take and transform the world. No pressure.
I know. Well, the SDGs play a crucial role, right, in focusing efforts, whether they are the efforts of young people, the efforts of individuals, or even the efforts of government, right? And we know that to a certain degree, all development is local. It doesn't matter where the efforts are from. It doesn't matter where the leadership and direction is from. It will happen at the local level for us to feel that impact. So the global goals provide us with that vision of what's possible. It focuses us, helps us prioritize our efforts, and gives us some clear metrics to track. That's all clear. But individual effort, individual ambition and determination is a very good start as well. And we see that increasingly in the work that I do. And sometimes it's important because there are situations where that is all that we have. And we know that the efforts of individuals eventually aggregates, because when we organize, when we coordinate our voices, when we bring our energy together and we collaborate on a broader scale, that becomes an effective tool that ordinary people can leverage to demand public action on the issues that matter. And this eventually triggers change. What would this look like? This would look like young people using social media to hold government more accountable. It would be their participation in politics to track government actions. It would also look like community leaders who are taking on roles that perhaps they did not train for in order to engage with political processes so that the lives of the people in their communities are better. It would look like professionals like me committing careers in a sector that is focused on developing the nation, or indeed my counterparts in government who took a route that would mean that perhaps they would no longer be able to afford the lifestyle that they could have had they focused their energies working in the private sectors. So these are just a few ways that individual contributions can aggregate and help us move the needle. And sometimes this happens in imperceptible ways, but we're in the decade of action, right? So accelerating sustainable solutions on poverty, on climate, on inequality, on education, all of this is imperative. We have a goal to have no hunger. There are still 40 million Africans in extreme hunger. We have goals around health and well-being. In my home country, Nigeria, there's only 29 million people, which is just about 14% of the population that has been fully vaccinated against COVID. In terms of jobs and economic growth, a lot of the labor force is vulnerable and have lost or will lose their jobs. There are solutions to these problems, and yes, we need to find what the root causes are and deal with them in systemic ways. But there's nowhere in the world that development has happened without a sort of multi-agent leadership that depends less on rank and power, but more on the determination, drive, commitment of people.
And so how do we measure that impact and then replicate and scale what works?
Well, in the work that I do, we have pretty sophisticated tools for our programming. So at the point of design, we make sure that we have all the baseline information on where we were with all our metrics. And then eventually we develop either a log frame or a results framework for that. And increasingly, these are capacities that we are providing technical assistance to government so that ministries, departments, and agencies that lead on these programs that are implementation of policies leverage those tools as well. In terms of large-scale impact, for us to do that, we would need things like, randomized controlled trials would be the gold standard. Longitudinal studies would be great for us to see where the impact has been, especially when you consider that the average development program would last anywhere between 3 to 8 years. And sometimes there are impacts, positive impacts from that long after the projects have ended. And so part of my role has been to make sure that we are telling the story in qualitative manners. We have recently concluded a study where we looked at all the programming over the years, regardless of the donor, around strengthening governance systems at the subnational level and what that has led to. And we learned a lot of things that were not captured in any project reports, were not reported to the donor at the time that the projects happened. But we found, one, that there is a sort of super network that evolves when you implement development programs. You have people coming from civil society who have been engaging on the same issues for years. You have people in government who have been recipients of technical assistance and have strengthened their capacity. And sometimes these people move in and out of spaces. You have people who work in government moving into the private sector, and people who work in civil society moving into government. And this provides this collective knowledge that is then applied towards development in every sector.
Yeah, no, I I think the importance of people taking what they have learned and what they have done and ensuring that it's replicated across their own impact is so critically important. And it brings me to my final question in the last 2 minutes to all of you. For everyone watching, what is their role in promoting and assuring the SDGs? What is their role? Feel free, just as a round robin, but Anene, Siddharth, James, what is the role of the people watching, and how can they deliver on the SDGs in their local communities?
Perhaps I could give it a start. I would just start with Kenya. Kenya was amongst the 10 most dangerous spaces for a woman to give birth. And we worked with 6 companies, Merck from the US, Huawei from China, Philips from the Netherlands, GlaxoSmithKline from the UK, Safaricom from Kenya, and the Kenya Healthcare Federation. We came together under the leadership of the government of Kenya. The United Nations convened, connected, and catalyzed a relationship that focused on 6 of the highest burdened counties with high maternal mortality levels. And in a matter of 2.5 years, we were able to reduce the maternal mortality levels by 1/3, which resulted in getting us invited to the World Economic Forum, because this had never happened before. I'm only giving it as an example of the power of public-private partnerships and the power of political leadership. So I call it the 3 Ps that are necessary that needs to happen. First is the political will. Second is the right public policies. Third is the right partnerships, like Amina Mohammed, our Deputy Secretary General of the UN, says, flip the orthodoxy. And that is what it's all about. Flipping the orthodoxy to make that change. Back to you.
Thank you, Siddharth. Anene?
I think that every nation needs to play the cards that they have, and that will differ country to country. In Nigeria, I would say that tackling macroeconomic reforms remains important. Social protection is imperative, as well as working with civil society, young people, to deal with the issues at hand.
Thank you so much. And James?
I think critically achieving the SDGs is about unlocking the potential of people and communities to address their own problems. In most cases, it's much less about the injection of resources or solving a problem for people, and more about figuring out what about their existing system is preventing them from solving their own challenges or from deploying their resources in the right way. And to that, then the answer to everyone is, if we take agency and we recognize that part of our role is figuring out, to Sid's point, how do we partner with others in an integrated way, but then also really asking the question, why haven't solutions worked in the past? So we're not just repaving the old goat paths, but we're actually saying systemically, where is the breakdown? Is it that we didn't have the money? Is it that we didn't have the technology? Is it that we didn't have the will? Or is there something else? And once we open it up that way, and once we think across silos and in terms of the entire system, with the motive capacities of the target populations and communities at the center, then you can unlock magical things. Because as we've seen in the case of China, once a population's own energy is unleashed, there is no limit to how quickly they can transform their circumstances.
Yeah. Thank you. It's ultimately, it ends up being about our own accountability, our own agency, and our own power to change in our communities, and for that change to have ripple effects across countries and across the world. Thank you to you 3 who are perfect examples of really owning that agency, holding yourselves accountable, and leveraging your own power to drive, maintain, support, and champion the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Allah.
Thank you.
Shukran.
Right.
We've heard how change at the local level is so critical, but decision-making at the global level is a powerful and necessary lever to ensure that we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm so honored to be joined today by 3 incredible guests, and I'm going to start with Rebecca Greenspan. You're currently the UN Conference on Trade and Development Secretary General, and you've long been an advocate for human development, serving at the highest levels of global policymaking. I have to ask, how do we reduce the impact of the world's crises on poverty and hunger, energy, finance? And how do we ensure citizens around the world are not collateral damage in these crises?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with the civil society and such wonderful advocates for the SDGs and against poverty and inequality. And let me address what you are asking me. First of all, I think that we need multilateralism and cooperation more than ever. I don't think that this is a choice anymore. It's an imperative, because the problems that we are facing are problems that we cannot solve, in a fragmented way. That's my first point. And I think that the present crisis that we are looking at, Ala, just have shown us that that is the case, yes. And how are we going to push for solutions at the international level and at the national and local level, as you said, to really cushion the blow of this cascading crisis, as the Secretary General Guterres has called them, is one at the international level. We have to mobilize the resources that are already there, that are already in the institutions that have to give an answer for the emergency that we are going through. We need the development architecture to really respond to the calls and demands that we have today. Second, we need social protection at the national level. People cannot protect themselves from systemic and global crisis. They need support and they need the networks of social protection to come about. And the countries have to put and learn from what they have done, for example, in the COVID crisis. They have to come and learn and put those solutions forward. But the international community have to give the liquidity to the developing countries so they can do it. In the present situation, the developing world is exhausted from the crisis. We have the climate crisis and the COVID crisis, and now the cost of living crisis after the war in Ukraine. And the countries have not done anything bad. It's just that the crises are really coming with such a force that they don't have the resilience to really respond to this alone.
But Secretary General Greenspan, what do you say to those who feel like multilateralism is part of the problem, that it doesn't serve the most vulnerable? How do we effectively respond to those multiple crises at the same time without leaving anybody behind through multilateralism?
Well, multilateralism is not perfect. The system also needs change. And I think that we recognize that. But that doesn't mean to get away from multilateralism as is happening, yes? It's geopolitics what is driving the world, not solidarity. Like the Deputy Secretary General said, solidarity is on vacations. We need to bring it back to the multilateral space. So what we need is those voices that are critical voices that we need to hear to come to multilateralism, not to go away from it. Because if we weaken it, we won't be able to solve any of the problems that we are facing together.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm going to turn now to Danny Sriskandarajah. You've been the CEO of Oxfam Great Britain for a few years. You are a leader in global development and civic action. You have been for decades. So in your view, what can and must people, businesses, and governments do to accelerate the fight against poverty and obtain equality across all sectors and spheres?
Well, look, I think a lot of us were so excited when the SDGs were agreed 7 years ago, right? Agenda 2030 gives us that roadmap for a more just, sustainable world. And, as Rebecca has just said, the tragedy of the last few years is we've got the roadmap, we've got the plan, but we're going backwards because we've been hit by crisis after crisis, all of which, the climate emergency, COVID pandemic, even the global impacts on food prices as a result of the conflict in Ukraine, all of those have been reminders of how deeply interconnected we are as a world, as a humanity. And yet we're going backwards. We're not coming up with better ways of addressing these global challenges. And in some ways, we're retreating into a nationalism, a sort of defensive mode where society or nation after nation is is trying to protect itself and disengage from the global system. And so I think the number one thing we need to be doing, all of us, whether we're businesses, civil society activists, or indeed, people who work inside government or policymakers, is to come back to that idea that we are in this together, that we need a reset of a sort of a global collaboration on so many of these mechanisms. I mean, one point I would sort of not quite disagree with Rebecca on is that, or build on what she said, is we need to unlock the resources sitting with many of these institutions, but we also need to find new resources. You know, we can't just keep compete against each other, you know, moving money that was supposed to be for development assistance into climate action and pretending we're going to solve the world's problems. We also need to mobilize new resources. And that's where non-traditional actors, you know, businesses, social enterprises and others, I think have a really important role to play to create the resources we need if we're going to have any chance of tackling these global crises.
But Danny, can I ask, how do we get to that level of thinking? Right now, there is I think a valid case in many regions that regional problems could be resolved before they become global problems, and that regions are often overlooked depending on where in the world they sit. And so what is your response? How do we ensure accountability? How do we ensure that we're acting before problems escalate? And how do we ensure that we're serving the most vulnerable and not just responding when it becomes something that impacts particular countries and regions?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. First is working with progressive businesses. What we found at Oxfam is it's becoming clearer that sort of extractive practices of a sort of greedy capitalism are starting to backfire for businesses, right? So you can't just produce goods and ignore the living conditions or the working conditions of your workers, you know, throughout the supply chain. And so that sort of idea that we're in this together is starting, I think, to manifest through certainly progressive businesses, and we need to lean into that and showcase good examples, nudge, sometimes name and shame businesses and others who are not doing as well as they can. But the second is really back to the sort of civic activism that Rebecca was talking about, which is, you know, for me, one of the tragedies of the last 7 years is we've got this document, this amazing document that leader after leader, you know, came to New York in 2015 and pledged all sorts of wonderful things. Many of those people are still in power, but none of them are being held to account properly for failing to act. You know, I don't know of a single official around the world who's lost their job because they failed to make adequate progress on the SDGs. And that's what we need. We need accountability so that these sort of warm words that are uttered by our leaders, you know, just don't sort of sit there with no action. And for that to happen, we need to invest in sort of global civic activism and connecting and building that sort of solidarity across movements so that we can get real traction on holding the powerful to account.
Well, you've made the perfect segue to Lisa John, the Secretary General of Civicus and a champion for human rights and international mobilization for 2 decades. Now, Lisa, really picking up on what Danny was saying about the importance of accountability, ensuring accountability, and a major lever for it to be able to drive that is civil society. How does civil society speak truth to power? And how can they frame narratives that are reflective of what's happening in communities? And how do they hold global policymakers accountable?
So I'm going to start by saying that, of course, things are incredibly bleak. It's the first time in 3 decades that we're actually seeing human development, kind of move backwards, and 9 out of 10 countries actually failing to meet human development indicators. And alongside that, you have a situation where most people in the world really don't have the ability to engage with governments or even speak their mind freely. So you have, 3.1% of the world's population in just 39 countries living in contexts where they can freely exercise their fundamental freedoms. So the freedom of expression, the freedom of peaceful association, and the freedom of assembly. But on the other hand, I think the concept of civil society has kind of dramatically expanded and changed in the past few years. So traditionally, we would think of civil society as organized actors, right? As agencies or groups of people who come together, who are visible at the international, regional, and local levels. I think what we've seen, particularly during the course of the pandemic, is that civil society really is defined by individuals all over the world who are passionate about values, who are passionate about justice, and are not waiting for somebody else to come and take the action that's needed to challenge systems. And in fact, Civicus has kind of recently released a report on trends from the last 10 years of civic action. One of the key features is the fact that local incidents, whether it's a change in taxes, whether it's rising, food or fuel prices, whether even something like a WhatsApp tax, for instance, in Lebanon, for instance, quickly being converted into issues that are more universal, into an analysis that's transnational, and into opportunities for collective action across the world. So, Black Lives Matter, for instance, and protests around that, or the Me Too movement, many of the other kind of challenges to austerity or to corruption, to the nexus really between the political and economic elite, have been fueled by people who don't belong to a professional development background, but actually are people from all walks of life. So health workers, journalists, students, even statisticians, for instance, really, standing up and saying that I have a commitment to human society, which is broader than just my national identity or my, limited kind of identity in terms of, social or immediate community linkages. And I think I'm going to end by saying that during the period of the pandemic, we saw that trust in government was, hugely challenged. It was a moment of reckoning, actually, for governments and large businesses. And it was really local civil society and local businesses that enjoyed the maximum amount of trust and engagement from communities across the world. So there's so much that we need to do to protect and preserve that. But the good news is that even if governments aren't doing it, citizens and people and communities are actually not sitting back and, waiting for change to happen. They're actually getting together and making it happen, irrespective of, the difficult circumstances.
No, and we've seen that throughout the crisis. We continue to see that in almost every crisis. It really is when communities and local civil society come together and really support one another. I suppose I have a question for all three of you, and I will start with you, Lisa, and then move through the panel. But how do we ensure these crises don't take attention away from the other threats to fundamental rights within societies and economies? Danny, you spoke a little bit about we can't just move pools of money from one bucket to the other. We have to expand it. What are the other ways beyond increasing resources, which we know are critical? How do we bring more people to the table to act on issues before they become a crisis?
So I think what we've seen from just observing the way in which civic action takes place across the world is the fact that when spaces for participation and representation are blocked, that's when you see growing unrest and the kind of tensions between different actors in society. So a crisis really is a call for greater spaces for dialogue and engagement and collective thinking about what needs to be done. And once again, I think governments across the world are really learning very slowly that the language and the mechanisms of participation have dramatically changed. The expectations from people to be part of decisions and to understand how decisions are made are much higher than they were before. And the kind of blind faith that a lot of leaders expected in the past, the command and control kind of, mode of operation just doesn't work anymore. And we're living in a generation where people want access to information, people want access to spaces for participation, and people really want to be seen in the room and be part of how decisions are being made on resourcing and the delivery of essential systems. And I think it's really critical for multilateral institutions to model that and to be at the forefront of demonstrating how that happens. So we're making calls, for instance, for a civil society and envoy within the UN, for a World Citizens Initiative that will allow citizens across the world to bring up proposals and to get the UN to actually back changes that are needed on the ground. And I think some of these innovations really need to be embraced urgently and immediately in order for us to be able to engage, national and local governments with similar mechanisms.
But Lisa, Danny, Rebecca, let me be a bit more specific. In the midst of COVID-19, we saw one of the biggest blowbacks on women's rights that we've seen, a 50-year blowback, very likely. We saw a silent pandemic of increased gender-based violence. We have seen really resulting economic stagnation or complete conflict in many regions. We're seeing food insecurity at an all-time high. These are, and we can all say, okay, this is all the result of the pandemic, but is it not also because we haven't actually been addressing those fundamental rights within societies and economies for some time now? And how do we ensure that crisis is not the only time we pay attention to communities and to challenges? Danny?
So I think that all of those issues and challenges you've been talking about need local answers and local action, right? The communities need to take back their rights and articulate and amplify their voices. But we also need global action on almost all of those things you listed. And the key is to sort of build from below, but also beyond borders. And in recent months, I've been reflecting a lot because Oxfam turns 80 this year, right? And was founded by some volunteers in the height of the Second World War who believed in internationalism, who said, they wanted to raise money to help people suffering famine across the Nazi-occupied bits of Europe. And they were people ridiculed them and said, you're naive internationalists, idealists, and yet that's exactly the solidarity we need today. Not forms of charity, we need to get beyond a sort of paternalistic form of charity and instead build a new internationalism in which we are connecting those local struggles with the global action that's necessary and fight against this retreat into nationalism, into sort of self-interest that we've seen at exactly the moment, as you say, Ala, where we needed more global solidarity.
Yeah. Rebecca?
Say first that the best way to build resilience is to reduce inequalities. And we have to go back to say that, yes. My second point is that skepticism or the lack of hope, yes, that the lack of the belief that you can change the world is the best way to leave things as they are, yes. If you don't believe that change is possible, you don't mobilize, yes. So we have to fight skepticism that it turns into cynicism, at a global level. And I think that we have to show that SDGs were really a step forward, that we can go back to it. We can show that the short and the long term start at the same time. Yes, that the long term is not like a succession of short terms, that you have to build the short term, the response to the emergency, thinking about the values and the objective that we set up for ourselves. And I think that this is something that we have to do together at the local level, at the national level, but also at the global level. If we don't believe in anything, Ala, nothing will change.
I think that is, we often say anger is mobilizing, but it's hope that is sustaining. And I think that your comments there really sum up the importance of actually believing that things can change and being dedicated to your values, even in the midst of crisis, and especially in the midst of crisis. I'm going to do one last round robin as we close this out by asking you, in one word, what do you think is the single most important thing to create an equal society? And I will start with you, Danny.
Solidarity.
Solidarity. Lisa?
Accountability.
Accountability. And Secretary General Greenspan?
Collective action.
We both know that's 2 words, but I'll give you a pass. I'll let it fly. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for giving us a perspective on what kind of change needs to happen at the global level and the kind of leaders that we have driving it. We appreciate the solidarity, accountability, and collective action that you 3 are bringing to the table and hope it inspires everybody watching us. Thank you. The key message I took from our incredible local and global speakers was the importance of accountability, collective action, and a belief that things can and will change. Crisis is inevitable, and the only thing that can shift the tide of inequality, hunger, and poverty is to invest in one another, to show up for one another. So ask yourself, how are you using your actions and your voice to speak up for others? How are you advancing the Sustainable Development Goals? Are you investing your voice, credibility, money, networks? Are you voting? In whatever space you hold power, be it your work, school, faith community, team, and especially your own home, are you leveraging your own power to create justice, opportunity, and space for others? Because change, durable change, starts at home, and it starts with each of us. This is what makes the Sustainable Development Goals so powerful and so essential. They're a global framework, but they give us the space to be intentional, to serve our communities, and to work together in solidarity. We have to learn from each other, listen, collaborate, and pivot our priorities to make them a reality. And I'm excited that you are joining us on that journey. We have 7 more years. Let's make it happen.